So in chapter 26, we go over to Jagger's home for dinner, and it's quite a different experience for Pip than it was when he went to Wemmick's. We're starting to see how Jaggers and Wemmick are foils of one another, so I'm going to refer to this little chart for you. When Pip goes to Jaggers, it's a different experience because it's 5 guys, no girls except for Molly. So we have Jaggers, Pip, Herbert, Drummel, and Startop. And Jaggers serves wine because he's rich, and so they get a little drunk and a little testy with one another, and Drummel almost throws a glass. So it's kind of, as Pip says, disagreeable, which was different from the dinner at Wemmick's. Pip found Wemmick to be so kind and wonderful. He was heartily pleased after that meal. And of course, Wemmick is middle class. He serves punch. He serves fowl from one of his portable property presents from one of his clients, and salad from his yard, whereas Jaggers has, fancy fish and sauces and those kinds of things. So we're seeing the social class differences between Jaggers and Wemmick in this little scene here. But also, we had learned from Wemmick that Jaggers keeps his doors and windows unlocked at night. He has this watch chain that's very valuable, and he almost taunts criminals to steal it. But Wemmick's the opposite. At his home, he has a moat, he has a drawbridge, he has a stinger that he shoots off a gun every evening at 9 o'clock. So Wemmick is very protective of his castle, and he has decorated it to his liking. Whereas Jaggers has a very rich, lovely home in Soho, but it's in disrepair. It's rather a stately house of its kind, but dolefully in want of painting with dirty windows. And when you go inside, the hall is bare, gloomy, little used. And in a corner, Pip notices there's a table with a shaded lamp where he seemed to bring the office home with him because there's papers all over it. So we see how Jaggers is all work all the time, but we know that Wemmick keeps his work life separate from his home life. It's almost like he's 2 different people. So these 2 characters are definitely foils of one another, and the dinner at Jaggers is just not as fun as it is at Wemmick's, which is interesting because Jaggers is richer. So I think Dickens is obviously making a statement through these meals about the importance of social class and money and how it does not have a direct impact on happiness. Now, one thing that Jaggers notices on page 224 is Drummel. We haven't really talked much about Drummel. He is a big, rich, greedy, mean guy, very smart, and he's one of Matthew Pockett's students, just like Pip is. And immediately Jaggers sees him, talks to Pip and says, "Who's the Spyder?"
Tell me, Pip, who was the Spyder? That blotchy, sprawly, sulky fella.
It's Bentley Drummel.
So that's going to be an idiosyncrasy of Drummel, is that he's classified as the Spyder, and that he's blotchy and sprawly and sulky. I don't know if you remember the chapter, I think it was chapter 11, where the cake was described, but there were blotchy spiders running in and out, and in fact on the back of your book is a big old spider. So we're having a direct connection from Drummel to Miss Havisham. What it means, we don't know yet, so stay tuned. But what's weird is that Jaggers likes Drummel. He's drawn to Drummel. Jaggers is a defense attorney. His hands always smell like soap because he's always washing them. He's trying to get the grime of his dirty work off of his hands. He defends criminals. And so for him to be drawn to Drummel might be foreshadowing that Drummel is some sort of criminal or some sort of something bad. So stay tuned on that. We do meet Molly, who is the wild beast tamed, as Wemmick mentioned. It's on page 225. She's about 40, and she has a quantity of streaming hair. And it's interesting that she's a housekeeper, and years afterwards, Pip says, "I noticed a dreadful likeness of that woman." So he's going to make a connection with her, sort of deja vu later. But there's just something about Molly that is strange, and Jaggers is really weird. He makes her show off her wrists.
Salute you, Kentish Pirate. You have the arms of a blacksmith.
Molly, more wine here. Talk of strength. I'll show you strength. Show me your wrists, Molly. Come on. And the other one, Chumbo. Show them. Show them. There's power. Very few men have the power that this woman has.
What do you think those scars are from? we will have to wait to find out. But more mystery in this incredible novel. Chapter 27 goes a completely different way. It's Joe coming to visit Pip for breakfast, and he has news from Kent. And so Biddy writes this sweet letter. My dear Mr. Pip, we talk of you every night. We wonder what you're saying and doing. Your ever obliged and affectionate servant, Biddy. It's such a sweet letter. Pip has not given any thought to Joe and Biddy since he's left for London. Remember, this is his sin stage. So I'm going to pause right here and show you a movie clip, and I'll be right back.
Brought your toasting fork as a present. You know, for crumpets and the like, but I see you have no need.
It's perfect, Joe. Thank you.
Tea or coffee, sir?
Oh, tea, sir. Please, if you don't mind. I find the coffee a little powerful. Us two now being alone, sir.
Sir. Joe, how can you call me sir?
Us two being now alone, Pip. I might tell you the reason for me being in the abode of a gentleman, which is that I've had a communication with a certain Miss A.
Miss A, Joe?
Miss Avisham. She wishes to see you on a matter of great import.
So in chapter 27, that's when Joe comes to visit Pip from Kent. He comes because he wants to bring news in person from Kent. News about Miss Havisham and news about Wopsle. So we'll get to that in a second. But the morning that he arrives, it's rainy. Pip says that Barnard's Inn is shedding sooty tears on the windows. And that's all objective correlative, really, for Pip's soul. He's just so terrible toward Joe in this scene. And I hope you picked up on that, because this is his sin stage. But money has corrupted him. On page, first of all, on page 231, we find out that Pip now has a servant. And he calls him the Avenger. His actual name is Pepper. But we only learn that one time. But the reason he's called the Avenger is because Pip avenges any grievances he has on this poor boy. And ironically, Pip has nothing for him to do. He's just been to these various homes, the Pocket family who had Flopson and Millers. And even Wemmick had a young girl who helps care for aged parent. And then, of course, Molly and Jaggers. So he's like, oh, well, I guess in London you have a servant. And so he has hired a servant whose idiosyncrasy, by the way, is his boots. He wears these boots that seem to aggravate Pip. And anyway, he has nothing for that guy to do. So that's number one symbol of Pip's emerging snobbery. Secondly is how he treats Joe. On page 231, he says, not with pleasure, though I was bound to him by so many ties. No, with considerable disturbance and mortification and a keen sense of incongruity. If I could have kept him away by paying money, I certainly would have paid money.
Joe! At least let me walk you to the coach.
I'll find my own way.
Barely spoken, Joe. I will show you some sights.
You and me are not two figures to be together in London. I'm wrong outside the forge and the kitchen and the marshes. You come sometime, you put your head in at the window of the forge and you'll see Joe the blacksmith. And what larks will have. But here, Pip, here I most off with go. So God bless you, dear old Pip, old chap. God bless you.
So throughout this scene, it's Joe, Pip, and Herbert, and then Herbert leaves, and this all takes place at Pip's apartment in Barnard's Inn, although in the movie you saw it was in like a little town square. But Joe is incredibly awkward. The news he comes to deliver is that, number one, Wopsle has quit the church, he's moved to London, and he's finally pursuing a career in theater. That's been Wopsle's dream since the beginning. So he's going to star in Hamlet, and we're going to get to see that in chapter 31. That should be really funny. But secondly, he wants to tell Pip about Estella. Estella has returned from studying abroad, and she is home, and Miss Havisham wanted Pip to know. And so that's the big news on page 237. Estella has come home and would be glad to see Pip. Oh, we haven't seen Estella in years. So that's coming up in chapter 29. But Sweet Joe picks up on all of Pip's disdain, and he stands up to leave before breakfast is even over. And Pip says, you know, why are you going? Are you going to come back? And Joe says, no, I'm not. but then everything melts. And by the way, Joe has been calling Pip Sir in this whole chapter, I guess trying to be respectful of Pip's new social class. But he says, you know what, Pip, dear old chap, I'm at the bottom of 237, life is made of ever so many partings welded together. Remember, he's a blacksmith. As I may say, one man's a blacksmith, one's a whitesmith, one's a goldsmith, and one's a coppersmith. Divisions among such must come, and must be met as they come. If there's been any fault today, it's mine. This has not been Joe's fault, this awkward breakfast, but he's taking the blame. He says, I'm wrong in these clothes, I'm awful dull, and I hope I've beat something out in the rights of this at last. And so God bless you, dear Pip, old chap. Old chap, God bless you. Sweet Joe. He leaves on good terms with Pip, and he doesn't blame Pip at all, and he leaves, and that's that. So we'll see if Pip ever goes to visit Joe or tries to make things right by him, but he has treated him terribly in this chapter. So chapter 28 very quickly is Pip returning home to Kent, and he hops on the coach, and Herbert says goodbye to him, and he says, goodbye, Handel, which is his nickname that he wasn't supposed to have. But it actually saves Pip, because who happens to be on this coach ride serendipitously but Stranger with the File from a million chapters ago. And he is, now we know, convict number 3, because he's being rearrested and taken back to the Hulks. And so Pip just happens to overhear on page 243 Stranger with the File having a conversation with some other guy who's not important, and they just so happen to be talking about convict number 1. This is all called, as we've talked about in class, Deus Ex Machina. Here Dickens is making things just magically work together for the purposes of moving the plot forward. And of course we have more objective correlative here. The weather was miserably raw, so we're having that misty marshes sort of rehash of imagery, so that we're placed back into when Pip was little and first encountered the convict. Page 243, here's what we find out about convict number 1. Pip is eavesdropping, and he says, convict number 1 told Stranger with the File, you're going to be discharged? Would you find out that boy that fed him, convict 1, and kept his secret, and give him the 2 one-pound notes? Yes, I would, and yes, I did. And the other guy says, well, that's a fool. I would have spent the money on myself. And he says, oh, it's okay. But here's what happened to the other guy, convict 1. He was tried again for prison breaking and got made a lifer. So what we now know is convict number 1 is in jail for life. And if he breaks out, he is going to get the death penalty. So I think Dickens is just trying to help us keep in mind that the convict thread is still there. We haven't seen it in a while, but it's still important. So that's kind of interesting. When Pip arrives in Kent, instead of going to see Joe and Biddy, he stays at the Blue Boar, which you may remember is the fancier of the 2 hotels you can stay in Kent. And he reads a newspaper article about how Pumblechook has taken all the credit for Pip's success. So that's at the end of chapter 28. Chapter 29, I call this the fairy tale chapter. Let me pause and give you a movie clip.
How do you do? You kiss my hand as if I was a queen.
You wish to see me?
Pip.
Okay, so back to the text itself. Pip has this mentality in chapter 29 that he is destined for Estella, that Miss Havisham is his secret benefactor, and that she is setting him up so that he will be worthy of Estella. He has not paid any heed to Herbert's warnings, to the fact that when he was little, Miss Havisham used to whisper in Estella's ear, break his heart. And so here is Pip's version of what's going on right now in the story. He's the knight, she's the princess, Miss Havisham is their fairy godmother, Joe is the wise man, Orlick can be the ogre if we're looking at this, in an archetype sort of way. And Satie's house would be the castle. And he says on page 245 in narration, she had adopted Estella and she is as good as adopted me, but it could not fail in her intention to bring us together. She reserved it for me to restore the desolate house, admit sunshine into the dark rooms, set the clocks a-going and the cold hearths a-blazing, tear down the cobwebs. In short, do all the shining deeds of the young knight of romance and marry the princess. Pip says I was the hero and Estella was the inspiration of it, the heart of it, of course. So this is Pip's denial about what's really going on here. We can probably infer that Miss Havisham's intentions are not pure. She has some sort of animosity toward men based on what happened to her at 8:40, and poor Pip is just going to be victim of it. Now, when he arrives at Satie's house on page 246, it's really interesting that Orlick is there. Orlick is the new gatekeeper for Miss Havisham. That's not good. We can't trust Orlick. And Orlick has access to a gun. At the bottom of page 247, Pip is looking and he says, my eye had been caught by a gun with a brass-bound stock over the chimney piece. And Orlick says, that's loaded. That's not good. That's like Dwight with a gun in the office when he shoots the gun in the office. So Pip changes the subject. Well, I'm going to go see Miss Havisham now. So Sarah Pocket's not the gatekeeper. Orlick is. Sarah Pocket is inside now. And she's as green and yellow with envy as ever because she too thinks that Miss Havisham is Pip's benefactor. Now, Estella is sitting right next to Miss Havisham, and Pip doesn't even recognize her. At the bottom of page 248, Estella was an elegant lady whom I had never seen. And Pip goes in, and Miss Havisham says, you kiss my hand as if I were a queen. And she says, well, and Pip still doesn't recognize her. And she says, well, and then on page 249, the lady whom I'd never seen before lifted up her eyes, and I saw her eyes were Estella's eyes. So much changed, so much more beautiful and more womanly. I mean, he is falling even harder for her. She is matured and she is gorgeous. She's been in France all this time studying, and they're still kind of mocking Pip at his expense. Bottom of page 249, she says, Miss Havisham says, is he less coarse and common, playing with Estella's hair? And they laugh, ha 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 ha, very much. He's changed, you know. Oh, geez. Anyway, Estella's going to be studying in London now. Isn't that interesting? That's where Pip is. So their paths will most definitely cross. Now, Estella, we've talked about Herbert gave Pip warning. Pip himself heard Miss Havisham say stuff. Estella is actually warning Pip in this chapter. She says, I have no heart if it has anything to do with my memory. And on page 252, she says, I have no softness, no sympathy, no sentiment there. And, you know, she says, yes, I have a heart in the sense that if it were shot in or stabbed in, I would cease to be. But she says, I'm serious. If we're going to be thrown together, you have to believe it. I have no tenderness. I haven't had any such thing. She's warning Pip, I can't love you. Pip's not listening. As she's talking, he is experiencing deja vu. What was it? What is it? What was it? Repeated several times on page 252. So he's seeing her in her older self, and he's like, man, something is really familiar about you. What is it? We'll have to wait to find out. Also, I want to point out Pip's source of his snobbery is found here on page 251. Because she says, oh, you know, you're hanging out with Herbert Pocket a lot. And he says, yeah, we're great friends. And she says, well, since your change of fortune and prospects, you've had to change your companions. Referring to Joe. And he says, naturally. She says, and necessarily, what was fit company for you once would be quite unfit for you now. So she's just reinforcing Pip's decision to stay away from Joe and to treat Joe poorly. So that evening, it gets really creepy. On page 254, I think I'm going to show you a movie clip of Miss Havisham saying these witches' curse words.
Love her. If she fails, you love her. But if she tears your heart to pieces, as it gets older, it'll tear deeper. But love her, love her, love her. I adopted her to be loved. I bred her to be loved. I educated her, and I developed her into what she is. And you know what love is, Pip? It is blind devotion. It is self-humiliation. It is degradation. It is utter submission. Giving up your heart and soul, as I did to that man.
Miss Havisham.
So, what did you think of that? Now, at the very end of the scene, Miss Havisham does not come to dinner. She doesn't eat. If she eats, it's in the middle of the night when no one can see. But Jaggers is there, and Pip has added, really I should say Dickens, has added an idiosyncrasy to Jaggers. It's a pocket handkerchief. And so when they sit down to dinner, first of all, Pip asks, what is Estella's last name? And Jaggers is like, what do you mean? He's like, is it Havisham? And he's like, it's Havisham. So I don't know what Pip was hinting at there, trying to find out where Estella originally came from. But then at the bottom of page 257, Estella comes in. And remember, she is so spoiled. She is adorned with jewels. She's rich. She's Miss Havisham's daughter, adopted daughter. And so there are jewels all over her. And Jagger's bushy eyebrows raise. And Pip is furious. He's like, what is this? That night at the Blue Boar, he screams into his pillow, I love her, I love her, I love her. And he just feels that he couldn't bear to be around Jaggers and hear him creak his boots at her and wash his hands of her, that his feelings should be in the same place with him. So does Jaggers have feelings for Estella? That age difference is a little troubling, but Pip is alarmed here. But what is Jaggers doing there in the first place? Why is Jaggers Miss Havisham's, quote, man of confidence? So at the end of the chapter, Pip says, you know, I was anything but low and small in keeping away from Joe, but my tears soon dried. God forgive me, soon dried. So he is staying away from Joe and Biddy right now, the people who loved him originally, while he pursues this empty future, hopeful for Estella. Thanks for watching. Bye.